in the first hexagram, we have the potential that lies there for unique individual expression. That is, unique individual expression as a physical mechanic. And at the moment that you get to the sixth line and you get to the potential to be objective about what really has creative value or not, that the next step in that is that in itself leads to a mutation in the way in which you mentally know things, or can lead to that. And that brings us to the 43rd hexagram, breakthrough. And breakthrough is the gate of insight. And this is the right angle cross of explanation. That is the 43, the 23, the 4, and the 49. The right angle cross of explanation. It is essential in the individual process, and of course this cross contains a definition, the 43, 23, which are in opposition, that it is essential in the individual process to be able to explain oneself. There is so much suffering in individuality through lack of being able to explain. And this is rooted in how the individual begins its process. I've been giving you a lot of focus on how important it is. The only thing that's really important is how you enter into your relationships with the other. That is, that you enter in according to your nature and according to your design. The 43rd gate is caught in a dilemma. And the dilemma is that it has a unique knowing, and it has to find some way to be able to explain that knowing to be accepted by society. It cannot do that unless it's living out its own nature, because it will not have the right timing. So much of, and so many individuals are deeply scarred by trying to express their knowing at the wrong time to the wrong people. Above the line it says, in order for achievement to be maintained, a new order must be fairly established. In order for mutation to take hold, explanation must be established. This is the key. And of course, this is an enormous dilemma. Not only do you have to enter in properly in terms of your definition, design, and type, but if you're an individual, and particularly if you're a 43 or a 43-23, you can't do anything unless you start at the very, very, very beginning. There is nothing more frustrating in the world than a 43-23 that knows everything and knows nothing. You see, this is a very quick, grasping mind. It can grasp the surface knowing of just about anything that comes its way. But that does not mean that it knows anything about it at all. And the 43rd gate is a gate of being deaf. You don't want to hear what anybody else has to say, ever. I'm a 43-23. Don't you try to tell me something. It's hard. I mean, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do about that. That is my nature. I'm not here to be influenced. And because individuals are not here to be influenced, they have restricted hearing and listening. If they don't live out their own individuality, they will suffer, I was going to say hair loss. We should get a medicine for that. They will suffer hearing loss. Very common for individuals to have problems with hearing. So the first thing to recognize about the 43 is that an insight can only be based on what can be grasped. And what can be grasped must be grasped at its most fundamental and basic. Now think about how this works. Let's say you have an education program And you're going to teach kids multiplication and division. Now, the whole thing about the individual child is that individual child has to be started off at the very, very, very beginning. It can never miss 1 + 1 = 2. If it gets the basic foundation, at some point in its process, it will leave the collective and it will have a base for its own unique mathematics. And will have the basis to be able to explain itself because it has the foundation of the knowing underneath. I know so many things on the surface. I'm a classic 4323. It's almost endless, the knowing that I have on the surface. But I didn't really understand what it was to be a knower until I spent 12 years knowing the same thing. And knowing it from the very beginning. Because I am the beginning of that, of human design. And in knowing the very beginning and the very basis, having the perfect education for a freak. Because I got all the formula right from the beginning, and everything else is easy. So the secret for the individual, and particularly for the individual mind, is that not only are you entering into a relationship properly as yourself, but you have to see that you can't enter in the middle and expect that you're really going to know. You have to start at the beginning. And only if you can start at the beginning will there be something for you in your life that will be a foundation for real knowing. Then you can explain it. Otherwise you can't. First line says it all. Patience. By the way, this line, Pluto, of course, was here not too long ago. That is, it was here at the end of the 80s. Patience. The recognition that new forms cannot be established until resistance has been eliminated. The depth necessary to bring into form an individual insight. Now, the whole thing about that is that you have to be focused on that. No interference. No interference from the outside. No interference from the inside. Venus in detriment, an impatience to enjoy the sweets of accomplishment, to be able to explain yourself, that inevitably leaves a sour taste in the mouth. A knower that doesn't really know. You end up with, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't know who they are. I don't know what they mean. I don't know what they want. I don't know who they think they are. Because the individual just puts out that wave of not being able to explain itself and is immediately alienated, ostracized, the stranger on the outside because they could not explain the knowing. Patience. The patience comes from the depth necessary to explain. See, people read the Gate of Insight and they think of its dictionary description. You know, this spontaneous moment of clarity. But that spontaneous moment of clarity is non-translatable. You have to be able to explain it. Which means that you have to go deep inside of it to know what it really is, and that takes time. The second line, dedication. Second lines are hermits. Second lines, Democrats. Second lines are hidden. So here we have the gift of insight that's hidden. That the knowing that needs to be called out. You can have a unique mind. The maintenance of specialized attitudes which promote breakthrough or promote insight. Unique mental habits and thought processes which promote insight. These beings, leave them alone. Don't distract them. They don't want to be distracted. Every once in a while in their life, they will need to be tested. That is, they will need to attempt to explain themselves and will be called out. But give them time. Don't distract them in their individual process. So where you have second lines that are screaming to be called out, this is not a line that's screaming to be called out. All second lines of all individual gates deny the possibility that anybody else is smart enough to teach them anything. And of course, that's very healthy for them. Otherwise, we don't get their uniqueness. You see, this lower trigram here, they're going to have a lot of trouble anyway. They're going to have a lot of trouble because they're not going to be able to externalize their knowing successfully if they're going to be dependent on others, because the lower trigram does not have those gifts. You know, it's their inner knowing process that's at work here. The moon in detriment. A dedication to action that when actualization is in sight may become incautious. By the way, this action is the action of the verbal gunslinger. I know. You know, I've been a formal teacher in my life, probably 10 years of my life in traditional institutions teaching people. And it's one of the most common things as a teacher in a classroom with kids is that you ask a question and there's always going to be those hands that leap up into the air that go, I know. And then you go, okay. And they don't know. I mean, they don't know. I mean, they know, but they can't say it. And they get very flustered. They get very uncomfortable. After a while, they don't put their hand up anymore. Because they say, I know, but you know, what do you know exactly? The urge for expression that will abandon its normal processes when an opportunity arises and get into trouble for it. I know, but if you can't explain yourself, you're a freak. You're just a freak. I mean, you know, I love this equation. That's my life. You know, basically, I'm just an eccentric freak. But I can explain human design. You know, that's my saving grace. Otherwise, they burn me down. You know, they put me in one of these places or whatever, or they give me some lithium or Valium or whatever they want to give me. Or they lock me in jail because I'm a bad boy. You know, to be able to express yourself and explain something as a mutative force gives you a certain amount of freedom. And it gives you a sense of completion. Third line. The third line is called expediency. Pluto exalted. It says the powerful drive for regeneration that will, when its insight, when breakthrough is threatened, use any means, align with any force, you can bet, and endure any condemnation to achieve its goal. A certainty in knowing that can withstand condemnation. So as a third line mind, I went through this process throughout my life. That is, experimenting with, externalizing, putting out my knowing. You know, trying to explain myself. And finding out that my knowing was not necessarily something that was mutative out of that. Basically, it just meant resistance. And I learned to meet that resistance out of the three. Trial and error, bonds made and broken. And it also means a trial and error mind. You know, what I thought I knew, I ended up not knowing because I didn't learn it from the beginning. I just took it from the surface as a knower. And the moment that I got into a place where I had to deal with it in depth, I realized it wasn't my knowing. You know, I mean, I've gone through these processes. But it does say that the gift of the third line, like all third lines, is that they keep on banging. And they build up a thick skin so that they can deal with any condemnation. I can deal with anybody and their story about me or design or all this stuff, whatever's going on. The moon in detriment, an oversensitivity to condemnation that may preclude justified expediency and result in failure. That is, individual insight abandoned in the face of condemnation. Everybody's life process operates through every aspect of a line. You know, for example, I have my nodes here. So I know the Plutonic side of this line, I know the lunar side of this line. It's just something you get to live out in your life. Everybody gets to live out those equations, even if you fix the line. It doesn't mean you don't know the other side. You do. It's just that you're fixed to one slant. So there are times when I don't like condemnation, because that's only natural. It will depend on the influences. That lunar force that steps into my face. I don't like the condemnation, but the nature of the third line is it can still stand up to that. It just becomes very sensitive. When I was a child, that was something that I really understood, because I would say I know about something that I didn't know, and I'd get hammered for it. And I would feel so uncomfortable with that. The challenge to my knowing, even though it was wrong. I mean, knowers don't easily accept such things. Because you see, the knower is what is attacked, never the knowing. Because the knower is a mutative force. And their knowing is separate. When it comes to the other attacks them. The transpersonal process is a different process, always. Here, the gift is the ability to know socially the other side, in this sense, to come to grips with the 23, to find out how to get the explanation across. Not to have somebody tamper with the knowing, but to try to avoid having someone tamper with the explanation of that knowing. And that requires a gift of the other, of recognizing the other that can only come from the transpersonal. The one-track mind. And you can see here that this keynote gives its name to the keynote for fourth lines. In other words, we talk about that, the fixedness, the one-trackness of externalization, the over-reliance and stubborn obsession with one's mental abilities in the face of recurring obstacles. This design, given mercurial mental gifts, may, though rarely, succeed. This is a lot like the 28-4. Holding on. You just keep banging it through. You hold on for dear life and you keep on expressing your knowing. Now, of course, the whole thing about individuals is that if they're absolutely, totally wrong, it's still going to take them a while to be able to accept that. Because you see, they have to hear that within themselves. I know those situations. Somebody comes up to me and starts screaming in my face. They figure that's the only way I'll hear them. And they scream in my face, and they're having to scream something in my face that's valid, justifiable. Now, in that moment while they're screaming in my face, they have no idea that I know that what they know is justifiable. As far as they're concerned, they don't know if I'm hearing them at all, and their voice is getting louder. You know what I mean? And they walk away after that experience totally annoyed, with the assumption that they've been banging their head against a brick wall. Now, the individual mind will then process all of that. And at some point, in its own mind, it will come up with its own version of what it was told, so that it's not influenced, and yet it can correct itself. Rationalizing is part of the individual process. And that's one of the things they do. They will never, ever accept on the inside that anybody is really right about them and their knowing. Even when they acknowledge that somebody is right about them and their knowing. They'll just turn it into something that is theirs so they can accept it. It's the handicap of the mutative force that it denies any kind of influence whatsoever. And so it creates dilemmas in this sense. Jupiter in detriment, a belief in inherent right action based on limited knowledge that shuns advice, the vanity to attempt expression without depth. You know, when people have this line, I say, go for it. You know, again, you know, you read this line, it's not about, oh, we got to fix that. Let's get the eraser. It's about entering into a relationship properly, and then it doesn't matter that that's what you do. It's right for you to do it that way. You're not here to take advice. You're here to be an arrogant little knower and to push your I know out at the world, whether the world wants it or not. Tough. And if they don't like it, hide and try another day. And learn the right timing. And maybe you should learn how to explain it a little better. You know, so eventually you can get it across. Remember something about the nature of individuality? That individuality operates out of what I call being a stranger of consequence. The power of mutation is at its greatest on first contact. If you don't mutate them when you meet them, you don't mutate them. So if you end up trying to be, you know, in their corner so you can continue trying to mutate them for years, it's not going to work. The individual has its greatest power, its first opportunity. So if you think about that in terms of knowing and getting to make an explanation to somebody, that when you explain your knowing, you know, this is a very important moment, because if it doesn't work, you're going to be handicapped in explaining that knowing for a long time. Both inwardly, in the sense that you really do not know, and outwardly in the reputation you have for not knowing. Difficult. So one has to be very careful that the timing is right. An individual who is in the happy part of their melancholy, who has followed the nature of their design, who has started in their knowing from the beginning, will be able to explain themselves without punishment. Even if the explanation ultimately is not satisfactory, there'll be enough of those who grasp the essence of it that they won't treat you as a freak, and they'll push you away. The moment you can explain yourself as an individual, and by the way, that doesn't mean that you, as an individual, you got to walk up to everybody and explain yourself. The moment you can, you have a different aura. I mean, the moment you can, you watch people walk down the street. You know? You can just see it because it's in their aura. You know, somebody who really doesn't know, it's in their aura. I love watching people move along streets. You know, I've spent over the last 10 years a lot of hotel time and city time and watching people. You see, I understand something about the totality. The totality is looking for the gift of awareness in form. This is the genetic imperative of the totality, to find awareness in form. We know that in many ways. We know that through esoteric things, handwriting, hand-reading, phrenology, all this different kind of stuff. You know, we know that there is this inherent magic that is there in the form. This process of explanation is the only way in which the form is changed. And without the explanation, there is no transformation in the form. None. You see, we're on the mental plane. All of us. We cannot escape it. It will not be escaped. It is here with us till the end. It's an awareness that we carry. And there is no place to go in our process until we're at peace with the mental plane. Mutation always disturbs the peace. So when mutation comes, it must be able to explain itself on the mental plane. Not just be in the world physically, but to be able to express and explain its nature on the mental plane. So that the mind and the mental world mutate as well. And it's an ongoing process. When you get to the last 7 minutes, 30 seconds of this fourth line, you get to the juxtaposition cross, and this is the movement from the 4 and the 49 to the 29 and the 30. We have the 43, 23, 29, 30, and this is the juxtaposition cross of insight. And these are people that have the true one-track mind. You know, these are people that know something, and they will hold on to that knowing all of their lives, and they will try to manifest it, whether they can explain it or not. The left angle cross is the cross of dedication. It takes enormous dedication. One has to be obsessed, the 30th gate. One has to be ready to make the commitment, the 29th gate. And it is a dedication to explain, but to explain at a much more profound level. That is to ensure that mutation gets into the world. You know, this is a evolutionary cross, pushing the evolutionary process. Dedicated to the commitment to new knowing. Dedicated to the need to experience in the life the new knowing. It's called progression. It is the weakest of all fifth lines. The moon exalted. The step-by-step adaptation to relationships which hinder insight, which hinder breakthrough, through practical actions which will not jeopardize eventual success. Here, the very practicality of this line gets in the way. The gift of knowing when a unique insight can be shared effectively with others, but on their terms. The moment that an individual is dependent on others for the way in which their expression takes place, they've already abandoned their nature. And yet they have no choice. It is, in fact, an aspect of the totality. Their gift of being able to come in a time of crisis with something practical is that they're basing the timing on what they're getting from the other. In other words, they're not controlling all of that. Venus in detriment, a tendency to concentrate on harmonizing relationships that tends to strengthen the position of restrictive forces rather than benefiting insight. An over-reliance on the receptivity of others that turns harmony into the conditioner of individual expression. I'm not going to tell my mother what I know about her because it'll just create problems. I'm not going to tell my lover what I know about them because it isn't going to lead to mutation. It's going to lead to alienation. It's going to lead to argumentation. It's going to lead to problems. I'm only going to tell those what I know who ask me and are my friends and are ready to hear what I know. The transpersonal gets in the way. Remember what I told you about going through this process is that you will see that in the genetic continuity of a line, all the fifth lines out of the 64 hexagrams, that they're going to be some in a natural position for them and others in an unnatural position. In other words, it's the opportunity for the full spectrum of fifth line possibilities to emerge. Here, the very transpersonal gift of being seductive doesn't work to the benefit of the knower. It might work to the benefit of knowing. Understand the distinction. But not to the benefit of the knower. The sixth line takes the name of the hexagram. it is the potential for insight. And as a cross, we have a line here with the sun exalted, which would eliminate the detriment. The actualization and centering that in breakthrough, or that in having an insight, naturally establish both internally and externally a new order. Whew! Think about what that says. Think about how difficult that is. That says that the moment that you know something, that it has to become automatically mutative, and you have to be able to live out that mutation right away. I mean, individuality is very existential. In the now, we've got to live it out right away. I want the mutation to take hold right away. Instant gratification. Instant mutation gratification. They go through their third line expediency. They go through this process of trying to get their knowing out, of having to deal with the other. But what they really want is that the explanation is it. You know, you get to the explanation and then everything follows. The beauty of that is that the 43.6 is very, very, very deep. If you have children or young people in your life and they carry mental individuality, they're going to have a lot of trouble in school because there's only certain subjects that will be of interest to them. There's only certain teachers that they will be able to abide. And it's so important for you that you encourage them to go deep into the things that they like, because that's where their depth mentally will grow. And not be afraid of their dislike or lack of interest in other things. Individuals are like that. They're quirky. But what they really like when they're young, if they're encouraged to really explore it, to start at the ground floor, then their unique gifts will emerge later in life, because they will have a solid foundation to base their explanation on. Here, the 43.6 can get to a point where it waits long enough in its knowing process to be clear in its ability to be able to explain it. And if not, it says nothing. It will simply stand there and it will tell you whether the knowing that is out there, the explanations that are out there, are possible or not, valid or not, mutative or not. But its wisdom is the recognition that mutation must take hold immediately or it's not valid. In other words, after the explanation cannot come, I do not know what you mean. This is the greatest tragedy for the 43.6. Remember that fear is in all awareness centers. The fear of the 43, the fear of the mind we call anxiety, that the fear of the 43 is that no one will know what it means. No one will know who I am. No one will know what I know. And the discomfort and loneliness that can be a part of that. Mars and detriment, an ego tendency that in insight, that in breakthrough sees justification of its lesser attributes and carries them over into the new order, where the value of knowing is more important than other aspects of the life. Remember that mutation, when it takes hold, is a cleanser that eliminates the old. And of course, one of the things about the transpersonal process of the individual is that there's always a fear. They always have to let people have access to the old, in the fear that if they take that away from them, that they won't be able to safely bring them into the mutation. You know, that's an aspect of my not caring whether you still are an astrologer or this or that. You know, I'm just babying you along. I mean, I know you're full of it, but at least I can bring you to the point of mutation. You know, but I'm not going to tell you that. You know, that's typical sixth line. this movement in the zodiac. If you have noticed that we have had 2 individual gates in a row and there's another 2 coming. And at the moment that we get to the point of real breakthrough, the moment that you have a mutative insight, what it generates is power and energy. That is, it allows you to have a foot pedal so that you can press it down and get all the juice and start driving off. Goes to the 14th hexagram, possession in great measure. No other gate offers more success, more power, more wealth, more grandeur than the 14th gate. And it gets all of that when its energy is there for the empowerment of explanation and example that work, that are mutative. When the 14 is involved in a true mutative process, it becomes very successful.